2. When Prince Ahmed came pretty nigh to these rocks he perceived an arrow, which he gathered up, looked earnestly at it, and was in the greatest astonishment to find it was the same he shot away. Certainly, said he to himself, neither I nor any man living could shoot an arrow so far, and, finding it laid flat, not sticking into the ground, he judged that it rebounded against the rock. There must be some mystery in this, said he to himself again, and it may be advantageous to me. Perhaps fortune, to make me amends for depriving me of what I thought the greatest happiness, may have reserved a greater blessing for my comfort. As these rocks were full of caves and some of those caves were deep, the prince entered into one, and, looking about, cast his eyes on an iron door, which seemed to have no lock, but he feared it was fastened. However, thrusting against it, it opened, and discovered an easy descent, but no steps, which he walked down with his arrow in his hand. At first he thought he was going into a dark, obscure place, but presently a quite different light succeeded that which he came out of, and, entering into a large, spacious place, at about 50 or 60 paces distant, he perceived a magnificent palace, which he had not then time enough to look at. At the same time a lady of majestic port and air advanced as far as the porch, attended by a large troop of ladies, so finely dressed and beautiful that it was difficult to distinguish which was the mistress. As soon as Prince Ahmed perceived the lady, he made all imaginable haste to go and pay his respects. And the lady, on her part, seeing him coming, prevented him from addressing his discourse to her first, but said to him, "Come nearer, Prince Ahmed, you are welcome." It was no small surprise to the prince to hear himself named in a place he had never heard of, though so nigh to his father's capital, and he could not comprehend how he should be known to a lady who was a stranger to him. At last he returned the lady's compliment by throwing himself at her feet, and, rising up again, said to her, "Madam, I return you 1,000 thanks for the assurance you give me of a welcome to a place where I believe my imprudent curiosity had made me penetrate too far. But, madam, may I, without being guilty of ill manners, dare to ask you by what adventure you know me? And how you, who live in the same neighborhood with me, should be so great a stranger to me?" "Prince," said the lady, "let us go into the hall, there I will gratify you in your request." After these words the lady led Prince Ahmed into the hall. Then she sat down on a sofa, and when the prince by her entreaty had done the same she said, "You are surprised, you say, that I should know you and not be known by you, but you will be no longer surprised when I inform you who I am. You are undoubtedly sensible that your religion teaches you to believe that the world is inhabited by genies as well as men. I am the daughter of one of the most powerful and distinguished genies, and my name is Peribanu. The only thing that I have to add is, that you seem to me worthy of a more happy fate than that of possessing the Princess Nuranihar. And, that you might attain to it, I was present when you drew your arrow, and foresaw it would not go beyond Prince Hyacinth. I took it in the air, and gave it the necessary motion to strike against the rocks near which you found it, and I tell you that it lies in your power to make use of the favorable opportunity which presents itself to make you happy." As the fairy Peribanu pronounced these last words with a different tone, and looked, at the same time, tenderly upon Prince Ahmed, with a modest blush on her cheeks, it was no hard matter for the prince to comprehend what happiness she meant. He presently considered that the Princess Nuranihar could never be his and that the fairy Peribanu excelled her infinitely in beauty, agreeableness, wit, and, as much as he could conjecture by the magnificence of the palace, in immense riches. He blessed the moment that he thought of seeking after his arrow a second time, and, yielding to his love, "Madam," replied he, "should I all my life have the happiness of being your slave, and the admirer of the many charms which ravish my soul, I should think myself the most blessed of men. Pardon in me the boldness which inspires me to ask this favor, and don't refuse to admit me into your court, a prince who is entirely devoted to you." "Prince," answered the fairy, "will you not pledge your faith to me, as well as I give mine to you?" "Yes, madam," replied the prince, in an ecstasy of joy, "what can I do better, and with greater pleasure? Yes, my sultaness, my queen, I'll give you my heart without the least reserve." "Then," answered the fairy, "you are my husband, and I am your wife. But, as I suppose," pursued she, "that you have eaten nothing today, a slight repast shall be served up for you, while preparations are making for our wedding feast at night, and then I will show you the apartments of my palace. And you shall judge if this hall is not the meanest part of it. Some of the fairy's women, who came into the hall with them, and guessed her intentions, went immediately out, and returned presently with some excellent meats and wines. When Prince Ahmed had ate and drunk as much as he cared for, the fairy Paribanu carried him through all the apartments, where he saw diamonds, rubies, emeralds, and all sorts of fine jewels, intermixed with pearls, agate, jasper, porphyry, and all sorts of the most precious marbles. But, not to mention the richness of the furniture, which was inestimable, there was such a profuseness throughout that the prince, instead of ever having seen anything like it, owned that he could not have imagined that there was anything in the world that could come up to it. "Prince," said the fairy, "if you admire my palace so much, which, indeed, is very beautiful, what would you say to the palaces of the chief of our genies, which are much more beautiful, spacious, and magnificent? I could also charm you with my gardens, but we will let that alone till another time. Night draws near, and it will be time to go to supper." The next hall which the fairy led the prince into, and where the cloth was laid for the feast, was the last apartment the prince had not seen, and not in the least inferior to the others. At his entrance into it he admired the infinite number of sconces of wax candles perfumed with amber, the multitude of which, instead of being confused, were placed with so just a symmetry as formed an agreeable and pleasant sight. A large side table was set out with all sorts of gold plate, so finely wrought that the workmanship was much more valuable than the weight of the gold. Several choruses of beautiful women richly dressed, and whose voices were ravishing, began a concert, accompanied with all sorts of the most harmonious instruments. And when they were set down at table the fairy Paribanu took care to help Prince Ahmed to the most delicate meats, which she named as she invited him to eat of them, and which the prince found to be so exquisitely nice that he commended them with exaggeration, and said that the entertainment far surpassed those of man. He found also the same excellence in the wines, which neither he nor the fairy tasted of till the dessert was served up, which consisted of the choicest sweetmeats and fruits. The wedding feast was continued the next day, or, rather, the days following the celebration were a continual feast. At the end of 6 months Prince Ahmed, who always loved and honored the Sultan his father, conceived a great desire to know how he was, and that desire could not be satisfied without his going to see. He told the fairy of it, and desired she would give him leave. "Prince," said she, "go when you please. But first, don't take it amiss that I give you some advice how you shall behave yourself where you are going. First, I don't think it proper for you to tell the Sultan your father of our marriage, nor of my quality, nor the place where you have been. Beg of him to be satisfied in knowing you are happy, and desire no more. And let him know that the sole end of your visit is to make him easy, and inform him of your fate." She appointed 20 gentlemen, well mounted and equipped, to attend him. When all was ready Prince Ahmed took his leave of the fairy, embraced her, and renewed his promise to return soon. Then his horse, which was most finely caparisoned, and was as beautiful a creature as any in the Sultan of India's stables, was led to him, and he mounted him with an extraordinary grace. And, after he had bid her a last adieu, set forward on his journey. As it was not a great way to his father's capital, Prince Ahmed soon arrived there. The people, glad to see him again, received him with acclamations of joy, and followed him in crowds to the Sultan's apartment. The Sultan received and embraced him with great joy, complaining at the same time, with a fatherly tenderness, of the affliction his long absence had been to him, which he said was the more grievous for that, fortune having decided in favor of Prince Ali his brother, he was afraid he might have committed some rash action. The prince told a story of his adventures without speaking of the fairy, whom he said that he must not mention, and ended, "The only favor I ask of your majesty is to give me leave to come often and pay you my respects, and to know how you do." "Son," answered the Sultan of the Indies, "I cannot refuse you the leave you ask me, but I should much rather you would resolve to stay with me. At least tell me where I may send to you if you should fail to come, or when I may think your presence necessary." "Sir," replied Prince Ahmed, "what your majesty asks of me is part of the mystery I spoke to your majesty of. I beg of you to give me leave to remain silent on this head, for I shall come so frequently that I am afraid that I shall sooner be thought troublesome than be accused of negligence in my duty." The Sultan of the Indies pressed Prince Ahmed no more, but said to him, "Son, I penetrate no farther into your secrets, but leave you at your liberty. But can tell you that you could not do me a greater pleasure than to come, and by your presence restore to me the joy I have not felt this long time, and that you shall always be welcome when you come, without interrupting your business or pleasure." Prince Ahmed stayed but 3 days at the Sultan his father's court, and the 4th returned to the fairy Paribanu, who did not expect him so soon. A month after Prince Ahmed's return from paying a visit to his father, as the fairy Paribanu had observed that the prince, since the time that he gave her an account of his journey, his discourse with his father, and the leave he asked to go and see him often, had never talked of the Sultan, as if there had been no such person in the world, whereas before he was always speaking of him, she thought he forbore on her account. Therefore she took an opportunity to say to him one day, "Prince, tell me, have you forgot the Sultan your father? Don't you remember the promise you made to go and see him often? For my part one have not forgot what you told me at your return, and so put you in mind of it, that you may not be long before you acquit yourself of your promise." So Prince Ahmed went the next morning with the same attendants as before, but much finer, and himself more magnificently mounted, equipped, and dressed, and was received by the Sultan with the same joy and satisfaction. For several months he constantly paid his visits, always in a richer and finer equipage. At last some viziers, the Sultan's favorites, who judged of Prince Ahmed's grandeur and power by the figure he cut, made the Sultan jealous of his son, saying it was to be feared he might inveigle himself into the people's favor and dethrone him. The Sultan of the Indies was so far from thinking that Prince Ahmed could be capable of so pernicious a design as his favorites would make him believe that he said to them, "You are mistaken. My son loves me, and I am certain of his tenderness and fidelity, as I have given him no reason to be disgusted." But the favorites went on abusing Prince Ahmed till the Sultan said, "Be it as it will, I don't believe my son Ahmed is so wicked as you would persuade me he is. However, I am obliged to you for your good advice, and don't dispute but that it proceeds from your good intentions." The Sultan of the Indies said this that his favorites might not know the impressions their discourse had made on his mind, which had so alarmed him that he resolved to have Prince Ahmed watched unknown to his Grand Vizier. So he sent for a female magician, who was introduced by a back door into his apartment. "Go immediately," he said, "and follow my son, and watch him so well as to find out where he retires, and bring me word." The magician left the Sultan, and, knowing the place where Prince Ahmed found his arrow, went immediately thither, and hid herself near the rocks, so that nobody could see her. The next morning Prince Ahmed set out by daybreak, without taking leave either of the Sultan or any of his court, according to custom. The magician, seeing him coming, followed him with her eyes, till on a sudden she lost sight of him and his attendants. As the rocks were very steep and craggy, they were an insurmountable barrier, so that the magician judged that there were but 2 things for it, either that the prince retired into some cavern, or an abode of genies or fairies. Thereupon she came out of the place where she was hid and went directly to the hollow way, which she traced till she came to the farther end, looking carefully about on all sides. But, notwithstanding all her diligence, could perceive no opening, not so much as the iron gate which Prince Ahmed discovered, which was to be seen and open to none but men, and only to such whose presence was agreeable to the fairy Paribanu. The magician, who saw it was in vain for her to search any farther, was obliged to be satisfied with the discovery she had made, and returned to give the Sultan an account. The Sultan was very well pleased with the magician's conduct, and said to her, "Do you as you think fit, I'll wait patiently the event of your promises," and to encourage her made her a present of a diamond of great value. As Prince Ahmed had obtained the fairy Paribanu's leave to go to the Sultan of the Indies court once a month, he never failed, and the magician, knowing the time, went a day or 2 before to the foot of the rock where she lost sight of the prince and his attendants, and waited there. The next morning Prince Ahmed went out, as usual, at the iron gate, with the same attendants as before, and passed by the magician, whom he knew not to be such, and, seeing her lie with her head against the rock, And complaining as if she were in great pain, he pitied her, turned his horse about, went to her, and asked her what was the matter with her, and what he could do to ease her. The artful sorceress looked at the prince in a pitiful manner, without ever lifting up her head, and answered in broken words and sighs, as if she could hardly fetch her breath, that she was going to the capital city. But on the way thither she was taken with so violent a fever that her strength failed her, and she was forced to lie down where he saw her, far from any habitation, and without any hopes of assistance. "Good woman," replied Prince Ahmed, "you are not so far from help as you imagine. I am ready to assist you, and convey you where you will meet with a speedy cure. Only get up, and let one of my people take you behind him." At these words the magician, who pretended sickness only to know where the prince lived and what he did, refused not the charitable offer he made her. And that her actions might correspond with her words she made many pretended vain endeavors to get up. At the same time 2 of the prince's attendants, alighting off their horses, helped her up, and set her behind another, and mounted their horses again, and followed the prince, who turned back to the iron gate, which was opened by one of his retinue who rode before. And when he came into the outward court of the fairy, without dismounting himself, he sent to tell her he wanted to speak with her. The fairy Peribenu came with all imaginable haste, not knowing what made Prince Ahmed return so soon, who, not giving her time to ask him the reason, said, "Princess, I desire you would have compassion on this good woman," pointing to the magician, who was held up by 2 of his retinue. "I found her in the condition you see her in, and promised her the assistance she stands in need of, and am persuaded that you, out of your own goodness, as well as upon my entreaty, will not abandon her." The fairy Peribenu, who had her eyes fixed upon the pretended sick woman all the time that the prince was talking to her, ordered 2 of her women who followed her to take her from the 2 men that held her, and carry her into an apartment of the palace, and take as much care of her as she would herself. While the 2 women executed the fairy's commands, she went up to Prince Ahmed, and, whispering in his ear, said, "Prince, this woman is not so sick as she pretends to be. And I am very much mistaken if she is not an impostor, who will be the cause of a great trouble to you. But don't be concerned, let what will be devised against you. Be persuaded that I will deliver you out of all the snares that shall be laid for you. Go and pursue your journey." This discourse of the fairies did not in the least frighten Prince Ahmed. "My princess," said he, "as I do not remember I ever did or designed anybody an injury, I cannot believe anybody can have a thought of doing me one, but if they have I shall not, nevertheless, forbear doing good whenever I have an opportunity." Then he went back to his father's palace. In the meantime the 2 women carried the magician into a very fine apartment, richly furnished. First they sat her down upon a sofa, with her back supported with a cushion of gold brocade, while they made a bed on the same sofa before her, the quilt of which was finely embroidered with silk, the sheets of the finest linen, and the coverlet cloth of gold. When they had put her into bed, for the old sorceress pretended that her fever was so violent she could not help herself in the least, one of the women went out, and returned soon again with a china dish in her hand, full of a certain liquor, which she presented to the magician, while the other helped her to sit up. "Drink this liquor," said she, "it is the water of the fountain of lions, and a sovereign remedy against all fevers whatsoever. You will find the effect of it in less than an hour's time." The magician, to dissemble the better, took it after a great deal of entreaty, but at last she took the china dish, and, holding back her head, swallowed down the liquor. When she was laid down again the 2 women covered her up. "Lie quiet," said she who brought her the china cup, "and get a little sleep if you can. We'll leave you, and hope to find you perfectly cured when we come again an hour hence." The 2 women came again at the time they said they should, and found the magician up and dressed, and sitting upon the sofa. "Oh, admirable potion," she said, "it has wrought its cure much sooner than you told me it would, and I shall be able to prosecute my journey." The 2 women, who were fairies as well as their mistress, after they had told the magician how glad they were that she was cured so soon, walked before her, and conducted her through several apartments, all more noble than that wherein she lay, into a large hall, the most richly and magnificently furnished of all the palace. Fairy Paribanu sat in this hall on a throne of massive gold, enriched with diamonds, rubies, and pearls of an extraordinary size, and attended on each hand by a great number of beautiful fairies, all richly clothed. At the sight of so much majesty, the magician was not only dazzled, but was so amazed that, after she had prostrated herself before the throne, she could not open her lips to thank the fairy as she proposed. However, Paribanu saved her the trouble, and said to her, "Good woman, I am glad I had an opportunity to oblige you, and to see you are able to pursue your journey. I won't detain you, but perhaps you may not be displeased to see my palace. Follow my women, and they will show it you." Then the magician went back and related to the Sultan of the Indies all that had happened, and how very rich Prince Ahmed was since his marriage with the fairy, richer than all the kings in the world. And how there was danger that he should come and take the throne from his father. Though the Sultan of the Indies was very well persuaded that Prince Ahmed's natural disposition was good, yet he could not help being concerned at the discourse of the old sorceress, to whom, when she was taking her leave, he said, "I thank thee for the pains thou hast taken, and thy wholesome advice. I am so sensible of the great importance it is to me that I shall deliberate upon it in council." Now the favorites advised that the prince should be killed, but the magician advised differently, "Make him give you all kinds of wonderful things, by the fairy's help, till she tires of him and sends him away. As, for example, every time your majesty goes into the field, you are obliged to be at a great expense, not only in pavilions and tents for your army, but likewise in mules and camels to carry their baggage. Now, might not you engage him to use his interest with the fairy to procure you a tent which might be carried in a man's hand, and which should be so large as to shelter your whole army against bad weather?" When the magician had finished her speech, the Sultan asked his favorites if they had anything better to propose. And, finding them all silent, determined to follow the magician's advice, as the most reasonable and most agreeable to his mild government. Next day the Sultan did as the magician had advised him, and asked for the pavilion. Prince Ahmed never expected that the Sultan his father would have asked such a thing, which at first appeared so difficult, not to say impossible. Though he knew not absolutely how great the power of genies and fairies was, he doubted whether it extended so far as to compass such a tent as his father desired. At last he replied, "Though it is with the greatest reluctance imaginable, I will not fail to ask the favor of my wife your majesty desires, but will not promise you to obtain it. And if I should not have the honor to come again to pay you my respects, that shall be the sign that I have not had success. But beforehand, I desire you to forgive me, and consider that you yourself have reduced me to this extremity." "Son," replied the Sultan of the Indies, "I should be very sorry if what I ask of you should cause me the displeasure of never seeing you more. I find you don't know the power a husband has over a wife. And yours would show that her love to you was very indifferent if she, with the power she has of a fairy, should refuse you so trifling a request as this I desire you to ask of her for my sake." The prince went back, and was very sad for fear of offending the fairy. She kept pressing him to tell her what was the matter, and at last he said, "Madam, you may have observed that hitherto I have been content with your love, and have never asked you any other favor. Consider then, I conjure you, that it is not I, but the Sultan my father, who indiscreetly, or at least I think so, begs of you a pavilion large enough to shelter him, his court, and army from the violence of the weather, and which a man may carry in his hand. But remember, it is the Sultan my father asks this favor." "Prince," replied the fairy, smiling, "I am sorry that so small a matter should disturb you, and make you so uneasy as you appear to me." Then the fairy sent for her treasurer, to whom, when she came, she said, "Nurjan," which was her name, "bring me the largest pavilion in my treasury." Nurgium returned presently with the pavilion, which she could not only hold in her hand, but in the palm of her hand when she shut her fingers, and presented it to her mistress, who gave it to Prince Ahmed to look at. When Prince Ahmed saw the pavilion which the fairy called the largest in her treasury, he fancied she had a mind to jest with him, and thereupon the marks of his surprise appeared presently in his countenance. Which Paribanu perceiving burst out laughing. "What? Prince," cried she, "do you think I jest with you? You'll see presently that I am in earnest. Nurjan, said she to her treasurer, taking the tent out of Prince Ahmed's hands, go and set it up, that the prince may judge whether it may be large enough for the Sultan his father. The treasurer went immediately with it out of the palace, and carried it a great way off, and when she had set it up one end reached to the very palace. At which time the prince, thinking it small, found it large enough to shelter 2 greater armies than that of the Sultan his father's, and then said to Peribenu, I ask my princess 1,000 pardons for my incredulity. After what I have seen I believe there is nothing impossible to you. You see, said the fairy, that the pavilion is larger than what your father may have occasion for. For you must know that it has one property, that it is larger or smaller according to the army it is to cover. The treasurer took down the tent again, and brought it to the prince, who took it, and, without staying any longer than till the next day, mounted his horse, and went with the same attendants to the Sultan his father. The Sultan, who was persuaded that there could not be any such thing as such a tent as he asked for, was in a great surprise at the prince's diligence. He took the tent and after he had admired its smallness his amazement was so great that he could not recover himself. When the tent was set up in the great plain, which we have before mentioned, he found it large enough to shelter an army twice as large as he could bring into the field. But the Sultan was not yet satisfied. Son, said he, I have already expressed to you how much I am obliged to you for the present of the tent you have procured me, that I look upon it as the most valuable thing in all my treasury. But you must do one thing more for me, which will be every whit as agreeable to me. I am informed that the fairy, your spouse, makes use of a certain water, called the water of the Fountain of Lions, which cures all sorts of fevers, even the most dangerous, and, as I am perfectly well persuaded my health is dear to you. I don't doubt but you will ask her for a bottle of that water for me, and bring it me as a sovereign medicine, which I may make use of when I have occasion. Do me this other important piece of service, and thereby complete the duty of a good son toward a tender father. The prince returned and told the fairy what his father had said, there's a great deal of wickedness in this demand. She answered, as you will understand by what I am going to tell you. The Fountain of Lions is situated in the middle of a court of a great castle, the entrance into which is guarded by 4 fierce lions, 2 of which sleep alternately, while the other 2 are awake. But don't let that frighten you, I'll give you means to pass by them without any danger. The fairy Peribenu was at that time very hard at work, and, as she had several clues of thread by her, she took up one, and, presenting it to Prince Ahmed, said, First take this clue of thread. I'll tell you presently the use of it. In the second place, you must have 2 horses, one you must ride yourself, and the other you must lead, which must be loaded with a sheep cut into 4 quarters, that must be killed today. In the third place, you must be provided with a bottle, which I will give you, to bring the water in. Set out early tomorrow morning, and when you have passed the iron gate throw the clue of thread before you, which will roll till it comes to the gates of the castle. Follow it, and when it stops, as the gates will be open, you will see the 4 lions, the 2 that are awake will, by their roaring, wake the other 2, but don't be frightened, but throw each of them a quarter of mutton. And then clap spurs to your horse and ride to the fountain. Fill your bottle without alighting, and then return with the same expedition. The lions will be so busy eating they will let you pass by them. Prince Ahmed set out the next morning at the time appointed by the fairy, and followed her directions exactly. When he arrived at the gates of the castle he distributed the quarters of mutton among the 4 lions, and, passing through the midst of them bravely, got to the fountain, filled his bottle, and returned back as safe and sound as he went. When he had gone a little distance from the castle gates he turned him about, and, perceiving 2 of the lions coming after him, he drew his saber and prepared himself for defense. But as he went forward he saw one of them turned out of the road at some distance, and showed by his head and tail that he did not come to do him any harm, but only to go before him, and that the other stayed behind to follow. He put his sword up again in its scabbard. Guarded in this manner, he arrived at the capital of the Indies, but the lions never left him till they had conducted him to the gates of the Sultan's palace. After which they returned the same way they came, though not without frightening all that saw them, for all they went in a very gentle manner and showed no fierceness. A great many officers came to attend the prince while he dismounted his horse, and afterward conducted him into the sultan's apartment, who was at that time surrounded with his favorites. He approached toward the throne, laid the bottle at the sultan's feet, and kissed the rich tapestry which covered his footstool, and then said, "I have brought you, sir, the healthful water which your majesty desired so much to keep among your other rarities in your treasury, but at the same time wish you such extraordinary health as never to have occasion to make use of it." After the prince had made an end of his compliment, the sultan placed him on his right hand, and then said to him, "Son, I am very much obliged to you for this valuable present, as also for the great danger you have exposed yourself to upon my account, which I have been informed of by a magician who knows the fountain of lions. But do me the pleasure," continued he, "to inform me by what address, or, rather, by what incredible power, you have been secured." "Sir," replied Prince Ahmed, "I have no share in the compliment your majesty is pleased to make me. All the honor is due to the fairy my spouse, whose good advice I followed." Then he informed the sultan what those directions were, and by the relation of this his expedition let him know how well he had behaved himself. When he had done, the sultan, who showed outwardly all the demonstrations of great joy, but secretly became more jealous, retired into an inward apartment, where he sent for the magician. The magician, at her arrival, saved the sultan the trouble to tell her of the success of Prince Ahmed's journey, which she had heard of before she came, and therefore was prepared with an infallible means, as she pretended. This means she communicated to the sultan, who declared it the next day to the prince, in the midst of all his courtiers, in these words: "Son," said he, "I have one thing more to ask of you, after which I shall expect nothing more from your obedience, nor your interest with your wife. This request is, to bring me a man not above 1.5 feet high, and whose beard is 30 feet long, who carries a bar of iron upon his shoulders of 500 weight, which he uses as a quarterstaff." Prince Ahmed, who did not believe that there was such a man in the world as his father described, would gladly have excused himself, but the sultan persisted in his demand, and told him the fairy could do more incredible things. The next day the prince returned to his dear Paribanu, to whom he told his father's new demand, which, he said, he looked upon to be a thing more impossible than the two first. "For," added he, "I cannot imagine there can be such a man in the world. Without doubt, he has a mind to try whether or no I am so silly as to go about it, or he has a design on my ruin. In short, how can he suppose that I should lay hold of a man so well armed, though he is but little? What arms can I make use of to reduce him to my will? If there are any means, I beg you will tell them, and let me come off with honor this time." "Don't affright yourself, prince," replied the fairy. "You ran a risk in fetching the water of the fountain of lions for your father, but there's no danger in finding out this man, who is my brother Skaber, but is so far from being like me, though we both had the same father, that he is of so violent a nature that nothing can prevent his giving cruel marks of his resentment for a slight offense. Yet, on the other hand, is so good as to oblige anyone in whatever they desire. He is made exactly as the sultan your father has described him, and has no other arms than a bar of iron of 500 pounds weight, without which he never stirs, and which makes him respected. I'll send for him, and you shall judge of the truth of what I tell you, but be sure to prepare yourself against being frightened at his extraordinary figure when you see him." "What? My queen," replied Prince Ahmed, "do you say Skaber is your brother? Let him be never so ugly or deformed, I shall be so far from being frightened at the sight of him that, as our brother, I shall honor and love him." The fairy ordered a gold chafing dish to be set with a fire in it under the porch of her palace, with a box of the same metal, which was a present to her, out of which taking a perfume, and throwing it into the fire, there arose a thick cloud of smoke. Some moments after, the fairy said to Prince Ahmed, "See, there comes my brother." The prince immediately perceived Skaber coming gravely with his heavy bar on his shoulder, his long beard, which he held up before him, and a pair of thick mustachios, which he tucked behind his ears and almost covered his face. His eyes were very small and deep set in his head, which was far from being of the smallest size, and on his head he wore a grenadier's cap. Besides all this, he was very much humpbacked. If Prince Ahmed had not known that Skaber was Peribanu's brother, he would not have been able to have looked at him without fear, but, knowing first who he was, he stood by the fairy without the least concern. Skaber, as he came forward, looked at the prince earnestly enough to have chilled his blood in his veins, and asked Peribanu, when he first accosted her, who that man was. To which she replied, "He is my husband, brother. His name is Ahmed. He is son to the Sultan of the Indies. The reason why I did not invite you to my wedding was I was unwilling to divert you from an expedition you were engaged in, and from which I heard with pleasure you returned victorious, and so took the liberty now to call for you." At these words, Skaber, looking on Prince Ahmed favorably, said, "Is there anything else, sister, wherein I can serve him? It is enough for me that he is your husband to engage me to do for him whatever he desires." "The Sultan, his father," replied Peribanu, "has a curiosity to see you, and I desire he may be your guide to the Sultan's court. He needs but lead me the way, I'll follow him." "Brother," replied Peribanu, "it is too late to go today, therefore stay till tomorrow morning, and in the meantime I'll inform you of all that has passed between the Sultan of the Indies and Prince Ahmed since our marriage." The next morning, after Skaber had been informed of the affair, he and Prince Ahmed set out for the Sultan's court. When they arrived at the gates of the capital, the people no sooner saw Skaber but they ran and hid themselves. And some shut up their shops and locked themselves up in their houses, while others, flying, communicated their fear to all they met, who stayed not to look behind them, but ran too. Insomuch that Skaber and Prince Ahmed, as they went along, found the streets all desolate till they came to the palaces where the porters, instead of keeping the gates, ran away too. So that the prince and Skaber advanced without any obstacle to the council hall, where the Sultan was seated on his throne, and giving audience. Here likewise the ushers, at the approach of Skaber, abandoned their posts, and gave them free admittance. Skaber went boldly and fiercely up to the throne, without waiting to be presented by Prince Ahmed, and accosted the Sultan of the Indies in these words, "Thou hast asked for me," said he, "see, here I am, what wouldst thou have with me?" The Sultan, instead of answering him, clapped his hands before his eyes to avoid the sight of so terrible an object. At which uncivil and rude reception Skaber was so much provoked, after he had given him the trouble to come so far, that he instantly lifted up his iron bar and killed him before Prince Ahmed could intercede in his behalf. All that he could do was to prevent his killing the Grand Vizier, who sat not far from him, representing to him that he had always given the Sultan his father good advice. "These are they, then," said Skaber, "who gave him bad," and as he pronounced these words he killed all the other viziers and flattering favorites of the Sultan who were Prince Ahmed's enemies. Every time he struck he killed some one or other, and none escaped but they who were not so frightened as to stand staring and gaping, and who saved themselves by flight. When this terrible execution was over, Skaber came out of the council hall into the midst of the courtyard with the iron bar upon his shoulder, and, looking hard at the Grand Vizier, who owed his life to Prince Ahmed, he said, "I know here is a certain magician, who is a greater enemy of my brother-in-law than all these base favorites I have chastised. Let the magician be brought to me presently." The Grand Vizier immediately sent for her, and as soon as she was brought Skaber said, at the time he fetched a stroke at her with his iron bar, "Take the reward of thy pernicious counsel, and learn to feign sickness again." After this he said, "This is not yet enough, I will use the whole town after the same manner if they do not immediately acknowledge Prince Ahmed, my brother-in-law, for their Sultan and the Sultan of the Indies." Then all that were there present made the air echo again with the repeated acclamations of, "Long life to Sultan Ahmed," and immediately after he was proclaimed through the whole town. Skaber made him be clothed in the royal vestments, installed him on the throne, and after he had caused all to swear homage and fidelity to him went and fetched his sister Peribanu, whom he brought with all the pomp and grandeur imaginable, and made her to be owned Sultaness of the Indies. As for Prince Ali and Princess Nuranihar, as they had no hand in the conspiracy against Prince Ahmed and knew nothing of any, Prince Ahmed assigned them a considerable province, with its capital, where they spent the rest of their lives. Afterwards he sent an officer to Prince Hyacinth to acquaint him with the change and make him an offer of which province he liked best. But that prince thought himself so happy in his solitude that he bade the officer return the Sultan his brother thanks for the kindness he designed him, assuring him of his submission. And that the only favor he desired of him was to give him leave to live retired in the place he had made choice of for his retreat. 1. Arabian Nights. The History of Jack the Giant Killer. In the reign of the famous King Arthur there lived in Cornwall a lad named Jack, who was a boy of a bold temper, and took delight in hearing or reading of conjurers, giants, and fairies. And used to listen eagerly to the deeds of the knights of King Arthur's Round Table. In those days there lived on St. Michael's Mount, off Cornwall, a huge giant, 18 feet high and 9 feet round. His fierce and savage looks were the terror of all who beheld him. He dwelt in a gloomy cavern on the top of the mountain, and used to wade over to the mainland in search of prey. When he would throw half a dozen oxen upon his back, and tie 3 times as many sheep and hogs round his waist, and march back to his own abode. The giant had done this for many years when Jack resolved to destroy him. Jack took a horn, a shovel, a pickaxe, his armor, and a dark lantern, and one winter's evening he went to the mount. There he dug a pit 22 feet deep and 20 broad. He covered the top over so as to make it look like solid ground. He then blew his horn so loudly that the giant awoke and came out of his den crying out, "You saucy villain! You shall pay for this, I'll broil you for my breakfast." He had just finished, when, taking one step further, he tumbled headlong into the pit, and Jack struck him a blow on the head with his pickaxe which killed him. Jack then returned home to cheer his friends with the news. Another giant, called Blunderbore, vowed to be revenged on Jack if ever he should have him in his power. This giant kept an enchanted castle in the midst of a lonely wood. And some time after the death of Cormoran Jack was passing through a wood, and being weary, sat down and went to sleep. The giant, passing by and seeing Jack, carried him to his castle, where he locked him up in a large room, the floor of which was covered with the bodies, skulls and bones of men and women. Soon after the giant went to fetch his brother who was likewise a giant, to take a meal off his flesh, and Jack saw with terror through the bars of his prison the 2 giants approaching. Jack, perceiving in one corner of the room a strong cord, took courage, and making a slip knot at each end, he threw them over their heads, and tied it to the window bars. He then pulled till he had choked them. When they were black in the face he slid down the rope and stabbed them to the heart. Jack next took a great bunch of keys from the pocket of Blunderbore, and went into the castle again. He made a strict search through all the rooms, and in one of them found 3 ladies tied up by the hair of their heads, and almost starved to death. They told him that their husbands had been killed by the giants, who had then condemned them to be starved to death because they would not eat the flesh of their own dead husbands. "Ladies," said Jack, "I have put an end to the monster and his wicked brother, and I give you this castle and all the riches it contains, to make some amends for the dreadful pains you have felt." He then very politely gave them the keys of the castle, and went further on his journey to Wales. As Jack had but little money, he went on as fast as possible. At length he came to a handsome house. Jack knocked at the door, when there came forth a Welsh giant. Jack said he was a traveller who had lost his way, on which the giant made him welcome, and let him into a room where there was a good bed to sleep in. Jack took off his clothes quickly, but though he was weary he could not go to sleep. Soon after this he heard the giant walking backward and forward in the next room, and saying to himself, "Though here you lodge with me this night, you shall not see the morning light. My club shall dash your brains out quite." "Say you so?" thought Jack. "Are these your tricks upon travellers? But I hope to prove as cunning as you are." Then, getting out of bed, he groped about the room, and at last found a large thick billet of wood. He laid it in his own place in the bed, and then hid himself in a dark corner of the room. The giant, about midnight, entered the apartment, and with his bludgeon struck many blows on the bed, in the very place where Jack had laid the log. And then he went back to his own room, thinking he had broken all Jack's bones. Early in the morning Jack put a bold face upon the matter, and walked into the giant's room to thank him for his lodging. The giant started when he saw him, and began to stammer out, "Oh, Dear me, is it you? Pray how did you sleep last night? Did you hear or see anything in the dead of the night? Nothing to speak of, said Jack, carelessly. A rat, I believe, gave me 3 or 4 slaps with its tail, and disturbed me a little, but I soon went to sleep again. The giant wondered more and more at this. Yet he did not answer a word, but went to bring 2 great bowls of hasty pudding for their breakfast. Jack wanted to make the giant believe that he could eat as much as himself, so he contrived to button a leathern bag inside his coat, and slipped the hasty pudding into this bag, while he seemed to put it into his mouth. When breakfast was over he said to the giant, "Now I will show you a fine trick. I can cure all wounds with a touch. I could cut off my head in 1 minute, and the next put it sound again on my shoulders. You shall see an example." He then took hold of the knife, ripped up the leathern bag, and all the hasty pudding tumbled out upon the floor. "Ods splutter her nails!" cried the Welsh giant, who was ashamed to be outdone by such a little fellow as Jack. Her can do that herself, so he snatched up the knife, plunged it into his own stomach, and in a moment dropped down dead. Jack, having hitherto been successful in all his undertakings, resolved not to be idle in future. He therefore furnished himself with a horse, a cap of knowledge, a sword of sharpness, shoes of swiftness, and an invisible coat, the better to perform the wonderful enterprises that lay before him. He travelled over high hills, and on the 3rd day he came to a large and spacious forest through which his road lay. Scarcely had he entered the forest when he beheld a monstrous giant dragging along by the hair of their heads a handsome knight and his lady. Jack alighted from his horse, and tying him to an oak tree, put on his invisible coat, under which he carried his sword of sharpness. When he came up to the giant he made several strokes at him, but could not reach his body, but wounded his thighs in several places, and at length, putting both hands to his sword and aiming with all his might, he cut off both his legs. Then Jack, setting his foot upon his neck, plunged his sword into the giant's body, when the monster gave a groan and expired. The knight and his lady thanked Jack for their deliverance, and invited him to their house, to receive a proper reward for his services. "No," said Jack, "I cannot be easy till I find out this monster's habitation." So, taking the knight's directions, he mounted his horse and soon after came in sight of another giant, who was sitting on a block of timber waiting for his brother's return. Jack alighted from his horse, and, putting on his invisible coat, approached and aimed a blow at the giant's head, but, missing his aim, he only cut off his nose. On this the giant seized his club and laid about him most unmercifully. "Nay," said Jack, "if this be the case I'd better dispatch you," so, jumping upon the block, he stabbed him in the back, when he dropped down dead. Jack then proceeded on his journey, and travelled over hills and dales, till arriving at the foot of a high mountain he knocked at the door of a lonely house, when an old man let him in. When Jack was seated the hermit thus addressed him, "My son, on the top of this mountain is an enchanted castle, kept by the giant Galligantus and a vile magician. I lament the fate of a duke's daughter, whom they seized as she was walking in her father's garden, and brought hither transformed into a deer." Jack promised that in the morning, at the risk of his life, he would break the enchantment. And after a sound sleep he rose early, put on his invisible coat, and got ready for the attempt. When he had climbed to the top of the mountain he saw 2 fiery griffins, but he passed between them without the least fear of danger, for they could not see him because of his invisible coat. On the castle gate he found a golden trumpet, under which were written these lines: "Whoever can this trumpet blow shall cause the giant's overthrow." As soon as Jack had read this he seized the trumpet and blew a shrill blast, which made the gates fly open and the very castle itself tremble. The giant and the conjurer now knew that their wicked course was at an end, and they stood biting their thumbs and shaking with fear. Jack, with his sword of sharpness, soon killed the giant, and the magician was then carried away by a whirlwind. And every knight and beautiful lady who had been changed into birds and beasts returned to their proper shapes. The castle vanished away like smoke, and the head of the giant Galligantus was then sent to King Arthur. The knights and ladies rested that night at the old man's hermitage, and next day they set out for the court. Jack then went up to the king, and gave his majesty an account of all his fierce battles. Jack's fame had now spread through the whole country, and at the king's desire the duke gave him his daughter in marriage, to the joy of all his kingdom. After this the king gave him a large estate, on which he and his lady lived the rest of their days in joy and contentment. 1. Old Chapbook. The Black Bull of Norroway. And many a hunting song they sung. And song of game and glee. Then tuned to plaintive strains their tongue. Of Scotland's Love and Lee. To wilder measures next they turn. The black bull of Norroway. Sudden the tapers ceased to burn. The minstrel ceased to play. The Coot of Keeldar, by J. Leyden. In Norroway, Langsine, there lived a certain lady, and she had 3 doctors. The oldest o' them said to her mither, bake me a bannock, and roast me a collop, for I'm gone awa, to seek my fortune. Her mither did say. And the doctor gied awa, to an auld witch washerwife and telled her purpose. The auld wife bade her stay that day, and gang and look out o' her back door, and see what she could see. She saw knocked the first day. The second day she did the same, and saw knocked. On the third day she looked again, and saw a coach and 6 coming along the road. She ran in and telled the auld wife what she saw. Aweel, quo, the auld wife, yonce for you. Sae they took her into the coach, and galloped aff. The second doctor next says to her mither, bake me a bannock, and roast me a collop, for I'm gone awa, to seek my fortune. Her mither did say. And awa she gied to the auld wife, as her sister had done. On the third day she looked out o' the back door, and saw a coach and 4 coming along the road. Aweel, quo, the auld wife, yonce for you. Sae they took her in, and aff they set. The third doctor says to her mither, bake me a bannock, and roast me a collop, for I'm gone awa, to seek my fortune. Her mither did say, and awa she gied to the auld witch wife. She bade her look out o' her back door, and see what she could see. She did say, and when she came back said she saw knocked. The second day she did the same, and saw knocked. The third day she looked again, and on coming back said to the auld wife she saw knocked but a muckle black bull coming roaring along the road. Aweel, quo, the auld wife, yonce for you. On hearing this she was next to distracted by grief and terror, but she was lifted up and set on his back, and awa, they went. Aye they travelled, and on they travelled, till the lady grew faint wy hunger. Eat out o' my right lug, says the black bull, and drink out o' my left lug, and set by your leavings. Sae she did as he said, and was wonderfully refreshed. And lang they gied, and sair they rade, till they came in sight o' a very big and bonny castle. Yonder we maun be this night, quo' the bull, for my auld brither lives yonder, and presently they were at the place. They lifted her aff his back, and took her in, and sent him away to a park for the night. In the morning, when they brought the bull hame, they took the lady into a fine shining parlour, and gave her a beautiful apple, telling her no to break it till she was in the greatest strait ever mortal was in the world. And that wad bring her oat. Again she was lifted on the bull's back, and after she had ridden far, and fairer than I can tell, they came in sight o' a far bonnier castle, and far farther awa, than the last. Says the bull till her, yonder we maun be the night, for my second brither lives yonder, and they were at the place directly. They lifted her down and took her in, and sent the bull to the field for the night. In the morning they took the lady into a fine and rich room, and gave her the finest pear she had ever seen, bidding her no to break it till she was in the greatest strait ever mortal could be in, and that wad get her out o't. Again she was lifted and set on his back, and awa, they went. And lang they gied, and sair they rade, till they came in sight o' the far biggest castle, and far farthest aff, they had yet seen. We maun be yonder the night, says the bull, for my young brither lives yonder, and they were there directly. They lifted her down, took her in, and sent the bull to the field for the night. In the morning they took her into a room, the finest of a, and gied her a plum, telling her no to break it till she was in the greatest strait mortal could be in, and that wad get her out o't. Presently they brought hame the bull, set the lady on his back, and awa, they went. And aye they gied, and on they rade, till they came to a dark and ugsome glen, where they stopped, and the lady lighted down. Says the bull to her, Here ye maun stay till I gang and fight the deal. Ye maun seat yoursel on that stane, and move neither hand nor fit till I come back, else I'll never find ye again. And if everything round about ye turns blue I hae beat the deal, but should things turn red he'll hae conquered me. She set hersel down on the stane, and by and by round her turned blue. Come why, joy, she lifted the ae fit and crossed it o'er the ither, sae glad was she that her companion was victorious. The bull returned and sought for but never could find her. Lang she sat, and I she grat, till she wearied. At last she rase and gied awa, she kedna war till. On she wandered till she came to a great hill o' glass, that she tried she could to climb, but wasna able. Round the bottom o' the hill she gied, sabbing and seeking a passage o'er, till at last she came to a smith's house, and the smith promised, if she wad serve him 7 years, he wad make her iron shoon, whereby she could climb o'er the glassy hill. At 7 years' end she got her iron shoon, clammed the glassy hill, and chanced to come to the auld washerwife's habitation. There she was telled of a gallant young knight that had given in some bluidy sarks to wash, and whaever washed they sarks was to be his wife. The auld wife had washed till she was tired, and then she set to her doctor, and baith washed, and they better washed, in hopes of getting the young knight, but they couldna bring out a stain. At length they set the stranger damosel to work, and whenever she began the stains came out pure and clean, but the auld wife made the knight believe it was her doctor had washed the sarks. So the knight and the eldest doctor were to be married, and the stranger damosel was distracted at the thought of it, for she was deeply in love wi' him. So she bethought her of her apple, and breaking it, found it filled with gold and precious jewelry, the richest she had ever seen. All these, she said to the eldest doctor, I will give you, on condition that you put off your marriage for a day, and allow me to go into his room alone at night. So the lady consented. But meanwhile the auld wife had prepared a sleeping drink, and given it to the knight, wha drank it, and never wakened till next morning. The lee-lang night their damosel sabbed and sang. 7 lang years I served for thee. The glassy hill I clamb for thee. The bluidy shirt I rang for thee. And wilt thou no waken and turn to me? Next day she kentna what to do for grief. She then bracked the pear, and found it filled wi' jewelry far richer than the contents o' the apple. Why, they jewels she bargained for permission to be a second night in the young knight's chamber. But the auld wife gied him on either sleeping drink, and he again sleep it till morning. At night she kept sighing and singing as before. 7 lang years I served for thee, and still he sleep it, and she nearly lost hope athegither. But that day when he was out at the hunting, somebody asked him what noise and moaning was yon they heard all last night in his bedchamber. He said he hardna ony noise. But they assured him there was sae. And he resolved to keep waking that night to try what he could hear. That being the 3rd night, and the damosel being between hope and despair, she brack her plum, and it held far the richest jewelry of the 3. She bargained as before. And the auld wife, as before, took in the sleeping drink to the young knight's chamber, but he telled her he couldna drink it that night without sweetening. And when she gied awa for some honey to sweeten it he poured out the drink, and sae made the auld wife think he had drunk it. They went to bed again, and the damosel began, as before, singing. 7 lang years I served for thee. The glassy hill I clamb for thee. The bluidy shirt I rang for thee. And wilt thou no waken and turn to me? He heard, and turned to her. And she telled him that had befallen her, and he telled her that had happened to him. And he caused the auld washerwife and her doctor to be burned. And they were married, and he and she are living happy till this day, for aught I ken. 1. Chambers, Popular Traditions of Scotland. The Red Inn. There were aunts twa widows that lived on a small bit o' ground, which they rented from a farmer. Ane of them had twa sons, and the other had ane. And by it was time for the wife that had twa sons to send them away to seek their fortune. So she told her eldest son ae day to take a can and bring her water from the well, that she might bake a cake for him. And however much or however little water he might bring, the cake would be great or sma, accordingly, and that cake was to be that she could gie him when he went on his travels. The lad gied away the can to the well, and filled it water, and then came away hame again, but the can being broken the maist part of the water had run out before he got back. So his cake was very sma. Yet sma as it was, his mother asked if he was willing to take the half of it with her blessing, telling him that, if he chose rather to have the hale, he would only get it her curse. The young man, thinking he might hae to travel a far way, and not knowing when or how he might get other provisions, said he would like to hae the hale cake, of his mother's molly son what like. So she gave him the hale cake, and her molly son along white. Then he took his brither aside, and gave him a knife to keep till he should come back, desiring him to look at it every morning, and as lang as it continued to be clear, then he might be sure that the owner of it was well. But if it grew dim and rusty, then for certain some ill had befallen him. So the young man set out to seek his fortune. And he gied that day, and the next day. And on the third day, in the afternoon, he came up to where a shepherd was sitting with a flock o' sheep. And he gied up to the shepherd and asked him wha the sheep belonged to. And the man answered, The Red Inn of Ireland. Ants lived in Bellygon. And stole King Malcolm's daughter. The king of fair Scotland. He beats her, he binds her. He lays her on a band. And every day he dings her. With a bright silver wand. Like Julian the Roman. He's one that fears no man. It's said there's ane predestinate to be his mortal foe. But that man is yet unborn. And lang may it be so. The young man then went on his journey, and he had not gone far when he espied an old man with white locks herding a flock of swine. And he gied up to him and asked whose swine these were, when the man answered, The Red Inn of Ireland. Repeat the verses above. Then the young man gied on a bit farther, and came to another very old man herding goats. And when he asked whose goats they were, the answer was, The Red Inn of Ireland. Repeat the verses again. This old man also told him to beware of the next beasts that he should meet, for they were of a very different kind from any he had yet seen. So the young man went on, and by he saw a multitude of very dreadful beasts, ilk ane o' them twa heads, and on every head 4 horns. And he was sore frightened, and ran away from them as fast as he could. And glad was he when he came to a castle that stood on a hillock, the door standing wide to the wa. And he gied into the castle for shelter, and there he saw an auld wife sitting beside the kitchen fire. He asked the wife if he might stay there for the night, as he was tired a lang journey. And the wife said he might, but it was not a good place for him to be in, as it belonged to the Red Inn, who was a very terrible beast, 3 heads, that spared no living man he could get hold of. The young man would have gone away, but he was afraid of the beasts on the outside of the castle, so he beseeched the old woman to conceal him as well as she could, and not to tell the Eden that he was there. He thought, if he could put over the night, he might get away in the morning without meeting the beasts, and so escape. But he had not been long in his hidey-hole before the awful Eden came in. And nae sooner was he in than he was heard crying, Snook but and snook ben. I find the smell of an earthly man. Be he living, or be he dead. His heart this night shall kitchen, my bread. Kitchen, that is, season. The monster soon found the poor young man, and pulled him from his hole. And when he had got him out he told him that if he could answer him 3 questions his life should be spared. The first was, whether Ireland or Scotland was first inhabited. The second was, whether man was made for woman, or woman for man. The third was, whether men or brutes were made first. The lad not being able to answer one of these questions, the Red Edin took a mace and knocked him on the head, and turned him into a pillar of stone. On the morning after this happened the younger Brither took out the knife to look at it, and he was grieved to find it a brown-white rust. He told his mother that the time was now come for him to go away upon his travels also. So she requested him to take the can to the well for water, that she might bake a cake for him. The can being broken, he brought hame as little water as the other had done, and the cake was as little. She asked whether he would have the hale cake why, her Molly son, or the half why, her blessing, and, like his Brither, he thought it best to have the hale cake, come the Molly son what might. So he gied away. And everything happened to him that had happened to his brother. The other widow and her son heard of that had happened frae a fairy, and the young man determined that he would also go upon his travels, and see if he could do anything to relieve his twa friends. So his mother gave him a can to go to the well and bring home water, that she might bake him a cake for his journey. And he gied, and as he was bringing hame the water, a raven o'er abune his head cried to him to look, and he would see that the water was running out. And he was a young man of sense, and seeing the water running out, he took some clay and patched up the holes, so that he brought home enough water to bake a large cake. When his mother put it to him to take the half cake why, her blessing, he took it in preference to having the hale why, her Molly son, and yet the half was bigger than what the other lads had got athegither. So he gied away on his journey. And after he had travelled a far way he met an old woman, that asked him if he would give her a bit of his bannock. And he said he would gladly do that, and so he gave her a piece of the bannock. And for that she gied him a magical wand, that she said might yet be of service to him if he took care to use it rightly. Then the old woman, who was a fairy, told him a great deal that would happen to him, and what he ought to do in circumstances, and after that she vanished in an instant out his sight. He gied on a great way farther, and then he came up to the old man herding the sheep. And when he asked whose sheep these were, the answer was, the Red Edin of Ireland. Ants lived in Bellygon. And stole King Malcolm's daughter. The king of fair Scotland. He beats her, he binds her. He lays her on a band. And every day he dings her. With a bright silver wand. Like Julian the Roman. He's one that fears no man. But now I fear his end is near. And destiny at hand. And you're to be, I plainly see, the heir of all his land. Repeat the same inquiries to the man attending the swine and the man attending the goats, with the same answer in each case. When he came to the place where the monstrous beasts were standing, he did not stop nor run away, but went boldly through among them. One came up roaring with open mouth to devour him, when he struck it with his wand, and laid it in an instant dead at his feet. He soon came to the Edin's castle, where he knocked, and was admitted. The old woman that sat by the fire warned him of the terrible Edin, and what had been the fate of the twa Brithers, but he was not to be daunted. The monster soon came in, saying, Snook but and snook ben. I find the smell of an earthly man. Be he living, or be he dead. His heart shall be kitchen to my bread. He quickly espied the young man, and bade him come forth on the floor. And then he put the 3 questions to him, but the young man had been told everything by the good fairy, so he was able to answer all the questions. When the Edin found this he knew that his power was gone. The young man then took up the axe and hewed off the monster's 3 heads. He next asked the old woman to show him where the king's daughters lay. And the old woman took him upstairs and opened a great many doors, and out of every door came a beautiful lady who had been imprisoned there by the Edin, and the ladies was the king's daughter. She also took him down into a low room, and there stood 2 stone pillars that he had only to touch his wand, when his 2 friends and neighbors started into life. And the prisoners were overjoyed at their deliverance, which they all acknowledged to be owing to the prudent young man. Next day they set out for the king's court, and a gallant company they made. And the king married his daughter to the young man that had delivered her, and gave a noble's daughter to ilk ane o' the other young men, and so they lived happily the rest o' their days. 1. Chambers, Popular Traditions of Scotland.